In your Money Watch tonight, a new study from economists at the University of Michigan predicts that over the next 5 years, the city's economic growth will continue and should weather nationwide slowdowns relatively well.
One statistic making headlines is how Detroit is lagging behind other cities in the Midwest. According to the study, only 36% of workers in the Motor City make a living wage, behind Milwaukee, Cleveland, Chicago, and Minneapolis.
Joining us now to break down the report is the director of the Research Seminar in Quantitative Economics at U of M, Gabriel Ehrlich, who was a co-author on this study. Gabriel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So the study found that only 36% of Detroit residents make a living wage, which seems pretty low. So first of all, how do you define living wage? And is that a specific number in Detroit?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a specific number. We adapted a living wage calculation from MIT. Dr. Amy Glassmeyer compiles data and breaks down basically a budget that considers different categories of spending necessary to, live a basic lifestyle. And we adapted that definition for Detroit. And just to give you a sense of the dollars, it depends on the type of household. But for a single adult, the threshold was about $34,000, and for a two-adult, one-child household with one working adult, it was about $67,000, just to give you a sense.
Why do you believe, from what you saw in this study, that Detroit is so far behind compared to those other cities in the Midwest?
We tried to examine that exact question statistically, and the most powerful explanation that we found was education. And in our data, education explained about a third of the gap between Detroit and its peer cities in the Midwest. Out of all of the variables we considered when we combined them, we could only explain about 40% of the gap, though. So there's a big component that remains unexplained.
So how does that differ, that education factor, from some of those other Midwestern cities comparatively?
Yeah, just to give you a sense, comparing Detroit to Chicago, more than twice as many of the earners that we studied in Chicago have a bachelor's degree than in Detroit. And so when we compare specifically Detroit to Chicago, education actually explains more than half the gap in the share of workers earning a living wage.
What surprised you the most from this entire study?
Well, the first thing that surprised me is how little of the variation we can explain. Like I said, we can explain less than half of the variation. A couple of other things that surprised me is that industries didn't seem to explain much of the variation between Detroit and its peer cities in the Midwest. And then finally, the differences in hours worked did have some explanatory power, but not a lot. So education really was the clear winner in that sense.
So when you mention industries, of course, Detroit is known for the auto industry, and we're about 10 days away from a potential strike that could have ripple effects throughout Michigan. How does that factor into the economic outlook for the coming 5 years or so?
Yeah, from our perspective, it really depends how long and how widespread a strike is. So when we think about a strike, we think, a relatively short strike that targets, one of the Detroit three automakers, something, similar to what we saw in 2019 with the strike against General Motors, is something that the Southeast Michigan economy and the Michigan economy, can get through. It will certainly be disruptive in the short run, but we don't see it affecting the long-term trajectory of the state economy. What worries me is, if a strike were to drag on substantially longer than that, we expect the spillover effects to the state economy to accumulate over time. So that's really what we're going to be watching.
How do you think the economy is going to grow over the next 5 years? I read that we're going to hit maybe around $50,000 for the average income, that living wage, by 2028. That is not a ton of money when you're talking about perhaps a family of four.
Yeah, absolutely. One piece of good news that I want to emphasize, because I think it doesn't always come through when people talk about Detroit's economy, is that wages in Detroit and for Detroit residents have been growing. So average annual wages for Detroit residents rose by almost 50% from 2014 to 2021. And that was substantially faster than we saw statewide. So, even though the level of wages, as you mentioned, is still pretty low, and, I don't want to downplay the struggle of living on that type of income, we are seeing progress in terms of wage growth.
All right, so something positive to take away there. Thanks so much for joining us today and for all the work you're doing. Economic forecaster Gabriel Ehrlich, appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much.